By the time the siege at Ruby Ridge ended, 3 people were dead: a U.S. Marshal, a 14-year-old boy, and a mother holding her infant daughter. More than 400 federal agents had surrounded a single family living on a remote mountainside in northern Idaho. What began as an arrest warrant over 2 illegally shortened shotguns escalated into one of the most controversial law enforcement operations in modern American history. The images from Ruby Ridge would dominate headlines, spark congressional investigations, and fundamentally change how millions of Americans view the relationship between citizens and the federal government. More than 3 decades later, people still argue over what happened. Some believe it was a necessary law enforcement operation that spiraled out of control. Others see it as one of the clearest examples of government overreach in American history. But before anyone chose a side, before the congressional hearings, before the lawsuits, and before the national outrage, there was simply a family living alone in the mountains of northern Idaho. So how did an arrest warrant become an 11-day siege? This is Morbid History Cases. Today we're examining the events of Ruby Ridge through the documented timeline, following the decisions, the mistakes, and the moments that turned an isolated cabin into the center of a national crisis. This is the story of Ruby Ridge. Long before television cameras arrived in northern Idaho, Vicki Weaver wanted something many Americans have imagined but few have ever pursued. He wanted to be left alone. Born on January 3, 1948 in Iowa, Weaver grew up in a working-class family before serving in the United States Army, during the Vietnam era as a combat engineer. Although he served during the conflict, he didn't see any combat in Vietnam. After leaving the military, he returned to civilian life, married Vicki Jordison in 1971, and for several years lived what most Americans would have considered an average life. The couple worked, raised children, attended church, and paid bills. Nothing about these early years suggested their names would one day become known across the country. But over time, both Randy and Vicki grew increasingly dissatisfied with the direction they believed America was taking. They distrusted growing federal authority. They rejected what they saw as an increasingly materialistic culture. And they dreamed of raising their children somewhere far removed from cities, politics, and modern life. For them, self-sufficiency wasn't a hobby. It was becoming a way of life. In the early 1980s, that dream became reality. The Weavers purchased 20 acres of heavily wooded land near Naples, Idaho, and the rugged mountain of the state's northern panhandle. The property overlooked steep valleys, dense forest, and miles of undeveloped terrain. Access roads were narrow and difficult to navigate, especially during harsh Idaho winters. Together, the family built a modest cabin, largely by hand. There was no neighborhood or nearby town, and there was no regular traffic passing by. The nearest neighbors were separated by forest and mountains. The isolation wasn't accidental. It was exactly what the Weavers wanted. Their children were homeschooled. The family stored food, chopped their own firewood, and relied heavily on themselves for daily survival. Days were spent repairing the cabin, tending the property, hunting, and preparing for Idaho's unforgiving winters. To the Weavers, Ruby Ridge represented independence, a place where they believed they could live according to their own values, free from outside interference. But complete isolation is difficult to maintain, even in the mountains. During the 1980s, northern Idaho became home to several extremist organizations, including the Aryan Nations, a white supremacist group headquartered near Hayden Lake. Randy Weaver attended several Aryan Nations gatherings and became acquainted with people involved in the movement. This part of the story has often been exaggerated over the years. There's documented evidence that Weaver attended meetings and associated with members of the organization. There's no verified evidence that he held a leadership position within Aryan Nations or directed its activities. That distinction matters, because while those associations attracted attention of federal investigators, they were not by themselves the reason Ruby Ridge happened. Instead, they placed Randy Weaver on the radar of the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, the ATF. By the late 1980s, federal agencies were increasing investigations into extremist groups operating throughout the Pacific Northwest. The goal was to identify criminal activity, gather intelligence, and recruit informants when possible. As part of that effort, an undercover informant established contact with Randy Weaver. At first, the conversations appeared ordinary. The two spoke repeatedly and built a relationship over time. Eventually, the informant asked Weaver if he could obtain 2 shotguns. Weaver agreed. The transaction seemed minor. 2 firearms exchanged hands, nothing more. But once the sale completed, federal agents measured both weapons. The barrels were shorter than the minimum length allowed under federal law. That single transaction transformed what might have appeared to be an ordinary private sale into a federal firearms offense. The charges were significant enough for prosecutors to seek an indictment. But investigators believed Randy Weaver might be useful for another reason. According to later testimony and court records, federal authorities discussed the possibility of Weaver cooperating as an informant against individuals connected to extremist organizations operating in northern Idaho. Weaver refused. Exactly how much that refusal influenced the government's strategy remains disputed. What is not disputed is what happened next. The firearm charges continued. A federal grand jury returned an indictment, and what had once been a quiet life in the Idaho mountains suddenly became a federal criminal case. For most people, that would have meant hiring an attorney and preparing for court. Instead, it became the first step toward one of the most controversial sieges in American history. For federal prosecutors, the next step seemed routine. Randy Weaver had been indicted on firearms charges. Like thousands of defendants every year, he was expected to appear in federal court and answer those charges before a judge. But before that hearing could take place, something happened that would become one of the most disputed moments in the entire Ruby Ridge story. The date. When Weaver was released pending trial, he was notified that he would be required to appear in court. However, paperwork sent to him by the U.S. Probation Office listed an incorrect appearance date. Instead of directing him to appear on February 20th, 1991, the notice he received identified March 20th. Whether that error alone caused everything that followed has been debated ever since. What is documented is this. When the actual court date arrived, Randy Weaver wasn't there. From the court's perspective, he had failed to appear. A bench warrant was issued for his arrest. To the federal government, the next step was straightforward. Locate Weaver, take him into custody, return him to court. But from Randy Weaver's perspective, the situation looked very different. He believed he had followed the instructions he was given. The sudden arrest warrant confirmed something he had already begun to fear, that the government could not be trusted. Those beliefs hardened almost overnight. Family members later described him becoming increasingly convinced that surrendering peacefully might not guarantee his safety. Whether those fears reflected reality or not, they shaped every decision he made from that point forward. And because Weaver remained at Ruby Ridge instead of turning himself in, responsibility for the case shifted. The Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms had investigated the firearms charge. Now, the U.S. Marshal's office was responsible for arresting him. On paper, the assignment sounded simple. Arrest a man wanted for failing to appear in court. In reality, it was anything but. The Marshals quickly realized that Ruby Ridge wasn't an ordinary residence. The cabin sat high above the surrounding valleys, with thick timber providing natural concealment and only a handful of practical approaches. Anyone attempting to reach the property would likely be seen long before they arrived. A direct assault carried obvious risks. There were children living inside. The terrain heavily favored the people already on the mountain, and there was reason to believe the family was armed. Rather than rushing in, the marshals chose patience. Over the following months, surveillance teams quietly observed the property. They identified trails leading to the cabin, studied daily routines, watched where family members walked, noted when livestock were fed, photographed the terrain, built maps. Their hope was simple: catch Randy Weaver somewhere away from the cabin, away from his family, away from the tactical advantage the mountain gave him. It never happened. Every trip into town became less frequent. The family remained close to the property. As the months passed, frustration grew quietly on both sides. To the marshals, Weaver appeared to be deliberately avoiding arrest. To Weaver, the unfamiliar vehicles, strange activity in the woods, and reports of government surveillance seemed to confirm his suspicions that federal agents were preparing for something much larger than a routine arrest. Neither side truly understood how the other was thinking, and that misunderstanding became increasingly dangerous. By the summer of 1992, more than a year had passed since the bench warrant had been issued. Federal officials had no peaceful resolution. Pressure to bring the case to an end continued to build. On August 21st, 6 U.S. deputy marshals entered the wooded area surrounding Ruby Ridge to conduct another reconnaissance mission. Their purpose was not to storm the cabin. It was to gather intelligence, verify observation posts, and continue planning an eventual arrest. The deputies moved carefully through the forest, using camouflage to avoid being seen. For a time, it worked. Then the family's dog noticed them. The dog, Striker, began barking before running towards the concealed marshals. The sudden noise echoed through the trees. Back at the cabin, 14-year-old Sammy Weaver heard the dog barking and immediately ran after the dog. Close behind him was family friend Kevin Harris. Within seconds, two groups who had spent months trying to avoid a violent confrontation unexpectedly found themselves face to face. Exactly what happened next has been debated for more than 30 years. Witness accounts conflict. Some memories changed over time. Government reports reached different conclusions on certain details. Because of those inconsistencies, historians still disagree on the precise order in which the first shots were fired. But while the sequence remains disputed, the outcome does not. During the exchange of fire, Deputy U.S. Marshal William Deegan was shot and killed. Kevin Harris suffered a gunshot wound to the chest, but survived. The Weaver family's dog was killed, and 14-year-old Sammy Weaver was fatally shot as he attempted to run back toward the cabin. He died only a short distance from home. The firefight lasted only moments. The consequences would last decades. News that a federal marshal had been killed spread quickly through law enforcement. What had begun as an effort to arrest a man wanted on firearms charges and failure to appear warrant was now something entirely different. The death of a federal officer transformed the operation overnight. Additional resources were requested immediately. Specialized tactical teams were mobilized, and one of the FBI's most elite units prepared to deploy to northern Idaho. For the Weaver family, the worst day of their lives had already unfolded. For the federal government, the siege had only just begun. The firefight on August 21st changed everything. For more than a year, federal authorities had been attempting to arrest Randy Weaver without a violent confrontation. In a matter of minutes, that objective disappeared. A deputy U.S. Marshal was dead. A 14-year-old boy was dead. Kevin Harris had been wounded, and both sides believed the other had initiated the violence. Within hours, the operation expanded dramatically. Federal agents established a growing perimeter around the mountain. Roads leading toward the property were secured. Additional personnel arrived throughout the night, and television crews began gathering outside the area as word spread that a deadly confrontation was unfolding in northern Idaho. The following day, one of the FBI's most highly trained tactical units, the Hostage Rescue Team, arrived to assume a leading role in the operation. Unlike the deputy marshals who had spent months studying the property, the Hostage Rescue Team entered an active crisis. One federal officer had been killed. The suspects were believed to be heavily armed. The terrain heavily favored the people inside the cabin, and no one could say with confidence what would happen next. As commanders evaluated the situation, new rules of engagement were approved. Those rules would later become one of the most controversial aspects of the entire operation. Under normal FBI policy, deadly force could be used only when an agent reasonably believed there was an immediate threat of death or serious bodily harm. The rules of engagement adopted at Ruby Ridge were broader. Years later, reviews by the Department of Justice concluded those rules conflicted with established FBI policy and should never have been implemented. At the time, however, the agents on the mountains were expected to follow them. That decision would soon have irreversible consequences. Inside the cabin, the Weaver family was trying to comprehend what had happened. Only hours earlier, 14-year-old Sammy Weaver had been alive. Now his body lay outside. Randy Weaver had watched his son die. The surviving children were frightened and exhausted. Kevin Harris was suffering from a gunshot wound. No one inside believed they could safely surrender. Outside, federal agents believed they were dealing with individuals responsible for killing a deputy marshal. The trust required for peaceful communication had almost completely disappeared. Every decision became more difficult than the one before it. On August 22nd, Randy Weaver, Kevin Harris, and 16-year-old Sarah Weaver briefly emerged from the cabin. Watching from a concealed observation point was FBI sniper Lon Horiuchi. As Randy moved toward a nearby storage shed, Horiuchi fired. The first round struck Randy Weaver in the back, seriously injuring him. Weaver turned and ran toward the cabin. Kevin Harris followed. Seconds later, Horiuchi fired again. The second shot missed Harris. Instead, the bullet passed through the open doorway of the cabin. Standing inside was Vicki Weaver. She was holding the couple's 10-month-old daughter, Elisheba. The bullet struck Vicki in the head, killing her instantly. The infant remained physically unharmed. The shooting immediately became the defining image of Ruby Ridge. The government maintained that the shot had been intended for Kevin Harris as he entered the cabin. But regardless of intent, the result was the death of an unarmed woman standing inside, holding her infant child. That image would remain etched into the public consciousness for decades. With Vicki Weaver dead, the siege entered a new phase. No additional shots were fired. Instead, the mountains settled into an uneasy silence. The cabin remained surrounded. Armored vehicles occupied nearby positions. Helicopters circled overhead. Negotiators repeatedly called for surrender using loudspeakers and field telephones. Inside, conditions steadily worsened. Food supplies became limited. Medical care for Randy Weaver and Kevin Harris remained minimal. The surviving children had now lost both their mother and their brother within 2 days. Each morning, federal commanders searched for a peaceful resolution. Each evening, the standoff continued. Across the country, newspaper and television networks covered the siege almost continuously. Americans watched from their living rooms as reporters described an armed family refusing to surrender to hundreds of federal agents. Questions began replacing headlines. Why had this happened? Could it have been avoided? Had the government's response become disproportionate to the original charges? Public opinion quickly became divided. Some believed the government had shown remarkable restraint under dangerous circumstances. Others believe the siege had become a tragic example of excessive force. Those debates continue to this day. As the days passed, negotiators realized traditional approaches were failing. The Weaver family trusted almost no one. Eventually, attention turned to former Green Beret Beau Grits. Unlike federal negotiators, Grits had established credibility with Randy Weaver and agreed to act as an intermediary. Rather than beginning with demands, Grits spent time listening. He spoke with Weaver about his fears, his family, and the situation unfolding around the cabin. Gradually, the conversations changed. For the first time since the siege began, surrender became a real possibility. On August 31st, 1992, after 11 days, Randy Weaver walked off the mountain. Kevin Harris surrendered beside him. The siege was over. No further shots were fired, but ending the standoff did not end the controversy. It marked the beginning of years of investigations, court proceedings, and public scrutiny. When the criminal case finally reached trial, the outcome surprised many observers. Kevin Harris was acquitted of murder and the other most serious charges against him. Randy Weaver was acquitted of murder, conspiracy, and assault charges. The jury convicted him only of failing to appear in court and violating the conditions of his release. Having already spent significant time in custody, he received little additional prison time. The verdicts fueled criticism of the operation and renewed calls for accountability. Congress held hearings. The Department of Justice conducted extensive reviews. Internal investigations examined nearly every major decision made during the siege. Among the strongest criticisms were those directed at the FBI's rules of engagement. Investigators concluded they had departed from established policy and contributed to unnecessary risk. Several FBI officials received disciplinary action. The Weaver family later reached a civil settlement with the federal government totaling approximately $3.1 million. Kevin Harris also received a separate settlement. The legal battles eventually ended. The public debate never truly did. Today, Ruby Ridge occupies a unique place in American history. It's remembered not simply because people died. Many law enforcement operations have ended in tragedy. Ruby Ridge is remembered because it forced difficult questions about government authority, constitutional rights, tactical decision-making, and the consequences of escalation. For some Americans, it became a lasting symbol of federal overreach. For others, it demonstrated how distrust, isolation, and armed confrontation can create conditions where even small mistakes carry devastating consequences. Whatever perspective someone brings to Ruby Ridge, one fact is impossible to ignore. Its impact reached far beyond a single cabin in northern Idaho. Less than a year later, another confrontation between federal agents and an isolated religious group would unfold outside Waco, Texas. Many Americans viewed that siege through the shadow of Ruby Ridge. And 2 years after Waco, Timothy McVeigh carried out the bombing of the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma City. McVeigh later cited both Ruby Ridge and Waco as events that fueled his anti-government beliefs, though responsibility for that act of terrorism rests solely with him. Ruby Ridge did not cause what followed, but it became part of the story of a turbulent decade that reshaped the relationship between many Americans and their government. More than 30 years later, the questions raised on that Idaho mountainside remain unresolved for many people. Not because history has forgotten what happened, but because history is still debating what it meant. Thanks for joining us on this journey. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you don't miss out on our next descent into the past. We'll see you next time.